Hello, good morning everyone. Dr. Shaima here. So I continue with hypothalamus today. So I would just like to highlight a little more on the role of hypothalamus in food intake or the control of hunger and appetite and feeding. Because yesterday when I did it, I had missed to tell you all few theories which governs the food intake and the water intake by hypothalamus. So basically the food intake is regulated by two groups of neurons which are present in the hypothalamus, and whenever you talk about the role of hypothalamus with food intake, the name of two scientists, Mr. Anand and J.R. Brobeck, comes into picture because they were the ones who demonstrated the presence of these centers in the hypothalamus. Now the two centers which governs the food intake in the hypothalamus is the ventromedial nucleus, which is referred to as the satiety center, and the lateral nucleus, which is referred to as the feeding center. Now the feeding center, it stimulates the appetite and increases the food intake in a person, whereas the satiety center, it inhibits the feeding center and brings satiety in the animal. So basically the feeding center, it's the lateral hypothalamus, I've already told you all, and the satiety center is the ventromedial hypothalamus. Stimulation of the feeding center brings up excessive feeding, and the stimulation of the satiety center causes cessation of feeding. Destruction of feeding center, you call it as anorexia, where the person starves to death. Destruction of satiety center, there would be voracious appetite, and it's called as, or it results in hypothalamic obesity. Now these coming up 3 slides is which I have missed telling you all in yesterday's class. So basically two centers regulate the food intake and the body weight, that is the ventromedial nucleus and the lateral nucleus of the hypothalamus. Ventromedial nucleus is the satiety center and the lateral nucleus is the feeding center. Now after food intake, the feeding center activity is inhibited by the satiety center. So basically the regulatory mechanism is governed by 4 theories: the glucostatic theory, the aminostatic theory, the lipostatic theory and the thermostatic theory. You need to know little about these: glucostatic theory, aminostatic theory, lipostatic theory and the thermostatic theory. So what the glucostatic theory tells us, an increase in the blood glucose concentration will result in increased feeling of satiety, whereas a drop in the blood glucose concentration has got just the opposite. It's very simple. Now in increased glucose utilization cause feeding center, or when there is an increased glucose utilization in the body, it will cause the inhibition of the feeding center and the satiety center gets activated. This is what the glucostatic theory tells. Now let's see what this aminostatic theory is. Aminostatic theory revolves around the amino acids. The amino acids in the blood have got very similar effects. Now food in the gastrointestinal tract would release polypeptide, and these polypeptides would act on the hypothalamus. Now when this happens, there is inhibition of food intake. CCK, GRP glucagon, somatostatin inhibits food intake. Injection of CCK into the hypothalamus also, you can see, reduces the food intake. Now the third theory, the lipostatic theory. Lipostatic theory talks about, connects the hypothalamus to food and the lipids. Increased levels of fatty acids and keto acids in the blood would activate the satiety center and it inhibits the feeding center. Please keep that in mind. When there is increased levels of fatty acids and keto acids in the body, might be immediately after food intake or through the process of digestion, it directly activates the satiety center and it will inhibit the feeding center. Now the hormone leptin is produced by the fat cells, and that will be in proportionate to the fat content. Now this acts on the hypothalamus, thus inhibiting feeding center. Leptin resistance can lead to obesity. So I think this brief description gives you a clear picture on what these different theories are. Now let's go to the last theory, which is the thermostatic theory. Thermostatic theory, where you call as, there's something called as the thermostatic set point, where at this set point there is regulation of appetite and feeding happening. Now appetite is increased when temperature falls below a set point. So that's what you see, there is increased appetite in cold weather, SDA, metabolic activity, increased heat production. So that's about the thermostatic theory. And I think influence on sleep I have already done in yesterday's class. So I think I just go to, I think where we had to continue was on the role of emotions, what hypothalamus, I think I have missed this also, the different connections to hypothalamus. Now when you look at the connections of hypothalamus, the different parts of the hypothalamus establish connections with the following part. There are some very important physiological connections here. So the main efferent connections are, I have just briefed up and summarized for you all. You have the limbic lobe, fibers coming from the limbic lobe via the median forebrain bundle, which reaches the hypothalamus. Fibers from hippocampus via the fornix to the mammillary body, from thalamus, globus pallidus, reticular formation, prefrontal and premotor areas, autonomic efferents, and the retina. These are the efferent connections of hypothalamus. Now let's see what are the efferent connections of hypothalamus. You have fibers going from hypothalamus to the limbic lobe, thalamus and prefrontal lobe, thalamus via the mammillothalamic tract, reticular formation, tracts controlling autonomic activity, hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. So these are basically the efferent and the efferent connections of hypothalamus. You need to be very thorough with that. There's something called as a Papez circuit also operating, which is a very important physiological connection in the hypothalamus, which is a very often asked viva question. Now the Papez circuit, I'll be dealing with that in the coming up slides, where you have, the Papez circuit works between the mammillary body, fibers goes to the anterior nucleus of the thalamus, from there to the cingulate gyrus, from there to the hippocampus, back to the mammillary body. That's a very important circuit. I'll come to that. Now let's, this was where we actually need to continue from yesterday's class, emotional behavior. Now along with the limbic cortex, that limbic system is the major one, which deals with the emotions and the behavior of a person. Now the hypothalamus along with limbic system controls the emotional reactions, and basically for this the center is the stimulation of the lateral hypothalamus. When the lateral hypothalamus is stimulated, there is reactions of intense anger, intense thirst, intense appetite. Now when you stimulate the ventromedial nucleus of hypothalamus, a feeling of satiety, placidity is shown. So this is basically the emotional control by the hypothalamus. So if you look at this, you get a picture that cerebral cortex, limbic system and hypothalamus together controls the emotion, and this is where the Papez circuit comes into picture. So the Papez circuit, you also call it as, basically these are the structures associated with the emotion. So you have fibers coming from circuit always means it's a few, like 4 structures here in Papez circuit is getting interconnected. So from mammillary bodies, impulses go to the anterior nucleus of the thalamus, from there to the cingulate gyrus, from there to hippocampus, hippocampus back to the mammillary body. This is what the Papez circuit is, which is a circuit which controls the emotions of the body. And now whenever there is a lesion of the ventromedial nucleus, it produces a rage, indicating that the VMN inhibits emotions. And if you see the role of stress, I think we have already discussed, and that hypothalamus basically protects the body from stressful conditions like exercise, hypoglycemia, hemorrhage. Hypothalamus minimizes the effect of stress by effectively activating the sympathetico-adrenal system. Both catecholamines and glucocorticoid secretion increases during stress, and all this would increase the blood glucose and the free fatty acid levels, and also increase the blood flow to the tissues. I just connected stress with the emotions. Now let's see what this sham rage is. The sham rage, if you see, when there is a transection of the brain below the thalamus and above the hypothalamus, then results this condition called as the sham rage. So what is happening in sham rage is the cortical connections are cut. So when the cortical connections are cut, or when there is a transection below the thalamus above the hypothalamus, the condition which results in the behavioral change which the experimental animal results in is the sham rage. And these are the features when mild stimulus, when all this is done, when there is a transection of thalamus above hypothalamus, there's a cut, the cortical connections are lost. What happens in dogs? They start barking, growling, they bare teeth and snap. Cats, what they start doing is, they start violently lashing the tail. There is erection of the hair, protrusion of the claws. And generally, in the animals with sham rage, there is tachycardia, rise in blood pressure, pupillary dilatation. There is a combination of fear and anger. So the physical manifestations of rage combined with unpleasant mental and emotional response to irritation is what you see in sham rage. And this happens when there is removal of inhibitory influence of the limbic cortex on hypothalamus, because when you cut or there is a transection between thalamus below thalamus above hypothalamus and all the cortical connections are cut, what is finally happening is the inhibitory influence of the limbic cortex on hypothalamus is gone, which results in all these factors. So you can see a picture here, the rat, protruded claws, the hair. So a combined reaction to fear and anger. So in this picture, you can see this is basically a summary of the principal hypothalamic regulatory mechanism. There are two slides. This you need to be very thorough with, because whatever I have been doing in yesterday's class and today's class, it's been put in a very order way in the tabular column, where the first column talks about the functions, what is a particular function, and from where the efferents are coming from and where it is being integrated. So if you look at the first one, you can see that temperature regulation, where hypothalamus plays a major role, how temperature is regulated. Temperature, you can see efferents are coming from, the temperature receptors are present in the skin, the deep tissues, the spinal cord, hypothalamus and many other parts of the brain. From there the fibers come, and where does the fibers reach? They reach the anterior hypothalamus, and there is a response to heat. Posterior hypothalamus, when the fibers come, the response goes for cold. Now the neuroendocrine control of few hormones are written here: catecholamines, vasopressin, oxytocin, the thyroid stimulating hormone, thyrotropin, TSH via the thyroid releasing hormone, or ACTH and the beta lipoprotein via the CRH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, prolactin, growth hormone. All these individually you need to know. For example, the catecholamines, the fibers come from the limbic areas which are concerned with the emotions. So whichever fibers coming from the limbic area which needs to take care of the emotions of the body, it will end on the dorsal and the posterior hypothalamus, and hypothalamus is able to control the catecholamine release. You look at vasopressin. For vasopressin, fibers come from, or the receptors are called as the osmoreceptors or the volume receptors. Few others are also there, and the fibers end in supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei of the thalamus. Oxytocin, you have touch receptors present in the breast, uterus and genitalia, and the fibers end same as the previous hormone, the supraoptic and the paraventricular nuclei, vasopressin. So vasopressin and oxytocin, you can see that it's ending on the same fibers. Now if you look at the thyroid stimulating hormone, where it comes via the thyroid releasing hormone, you can see that the temperature receptors are present in infants, and it finally ends on the paraventricular nuclei and the neighboring areas of the hypothalamus. Now ACTH and the beta lipoprotein, limbic system from where the emotional stimuli come, the reticular formation from where the systemic stimuli is picked up, Hypothalamic and the anterior-pituitary cells, which are very sensitive to circulating blood cortisol level from suprachiasmatic nuclei, which takes care of the diurnal rhythm. So fibers from all these areas, the limbic system, hypothalamic and the anterior pituitary, the suprachiasmatic nuclei, from all that the fibers come and they end on the paraventricular nuclei. So it's basically that fibers which controls the ACTH and the beta lipoprotein secretion. Now then you have the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone, where the control happens through the gonadotropin releasing hormone. The hypothalamic cells, which are very sensitive to estrogens, in the eyes, touch receptors in the skin and the genitalia of reflex of all the ovulating species. The fibers come from all these areas and it ends on the preoptic areas and few other areas also. You just need to remember the preoptic area. So it's from this fibers coming from the cells in the hypothalamus, which are sensitive to estrogen, from the eyes, touch receptors in the skin, genitalia, and the fibers ending in the preoptic area, which is taking care of the secretion of FSH and LH, which is happening via the GnRH. Now if you look at prolactin, then you can see that you have similar to oxytocin, you have touch receptors present in the breast, and the fibers ends at the arcuate nucleus and few other areas of the hypothalamus. Now the growth hormone acts via somatostatin and GRH. The receptors from where these fibers come are still not known, but it's very clear that the fibers are ending on the paraventricular nucleus and also the arcuate nucleus. So I think if you can memorize this table, you get a very clear picture. Even exam point of view, scoring becomes very easy when the hypothalamic regulatory mechanisms needs to be mentioned. And even though it's not specified and asked, it's understood that when hypothalamus comes as a 10 marker, you need to include this. So now we have the last one, the appetitive behavior, like where you talk about thirst, hunger and sexual behavior. Thirst, it's basically from where does the fibers come? You have the osmoreceptors, which are probably located in the lamina terminalis, and the angiotensin II uptake in the subformical organ, and the fibers end in the lateral superior part of the hypothalamus. Now for hunger, you have got the glucostat cells, which are sensitive to the level of glucose, or which are sensitive to glucose utilization. The leptin receptors and receptors for other polypeptides. This is from where the fibers arise from, and they end on the ventromedial arcuate and paraventricular nuclei and also the lateral hypothalamus. So that is where it's a connection between this glucostatic cells with the ventromedial arcuate, paraventricular nuclei and the lateral hypothalamus. The hunger in a person is controlled. Now when it comes to sexual behavior, the cells which are sensitive to circulating estrogen, androgens and few others, it comes from there. From there impulses or the message would reach the anterior ventral hypothalamus. Also in the male, it's also from the piriform cortex. So with this connections cells to the hypothalamus, the sexual behavior in a person is controlled. Now I have the final one where we talk about the defensive reactions, like fear, rage, how is it controlled. So now for fear and rage, you have sense organs and the neocortex. That's from where it starts, but the path is actually not clear even now. And those fibers, they actually diffuse in the limbic system and the hypothalamus. So basically hypothalamus and limbic system together, coordinating with sense organs and the neocortex, is actually controlling the feelings like fear and rage. Now when it comes to the body rhythms, retina is the main source point, and that comes via the retinohypothalamic fibers, and the fibers from the retinohypothalamus reaches the suprachiasmatic nuclei and it controls or regulates the particular aspect of body rhythms. So that's about hypothalamus. So I think you need to be very thorough with that. Connections, functions, especially the summary also should be done. The connection should be drawn. Please keep in mind the Papez circuit For all the functions, for all the circuits which has been mentioned, it will be good if you can make your own diagrams. Few textbooks also give diagrams, like where something like a mind map, factors that stimulate the thirst center. You have something like a mind map drawn. So I think you can take the help of that, so that when you put it for the exam, it becomes really scoring rather than trying to write pages and pages together. So I think there we end with hypothalamus. So please study well. Hypothalamus, cerebellum, basal ganglia. I think that's it. Those are the three topics in CNS. Tracks can also come. The very often asked 10 markers. So basal ganglia, hypothalamus, cerebellum, you need to be really thorough with for a 10 marker. Because if a 10 marker doesn't come, please expect that there would be so many 5 markers and 3 markers from these topics. Plus you need to be very thorough with the ascending and the descending tracts. Please don't leave any topic in central nervous system, because I told you, you cannot afford to leave, because out of a 100-mark paper, around 55 to 60 marks come alone from CNS and special senses together. So if you have the habit of picking up and learning, that can really put you in trouble. And if you are in and out thorough with central nervous system and special senses, please be sure that you would really score very well in paper 2. So I think that's for today's class. So bye till I meet you for the next class. Study well. Thank you.